Welcome to Cambridge Forum. I'm Tim Weiskell, a member of the Cambridge Forum Board. On today's program, we're assessing the health of the environment with the help of Dr. Robert Watson, Chief Scientist at the World Bank and co-chair of the United Nations Millennium Ecosystem Assessment report. We're joined as well by author and environmentalist Bill McKibben, journalist and NPR Living on Earth radio host Steve Curwood, and journalist and author Ross Gelbspan. Ross will be chairing the discussion. Ross?
Thank you, Tim. Thank you very much. We have just heard a wonderful session with some of the world's top climate scientists, and I must say these scientists are absolutely flawless in their methodology. They're extremely elegant in their variety of approaches, and their work is really beyond reproach. And by contrast, of course, us journalists are trained from birth to distort and oversimplify and sensationalize. So I do hope that Dr. Watson puts up with us as we go forward here. We will take turns asking questions. We'll have follow-ups. We'd like to keep the exchange fairly lively if we can. I'm going to start with two quick questions to Dr. Watson, one question and then a follow-up, and then Steve and Bill will proceed from there. Dr. Watson, there seems to be a disconnect a little bit between the urgency of the situation and the minimalist approach, not only in the United States, but in the World Bank as well, especially given the IPCC's mandate that we need to reduce emissions worldwide by 70%. For one example, the prototype carbon fund that you helped develop at the World Bank is underfunded by about an order of magnitude. It seems like it would need billions rather than millions to be really affected. As you were very eloquent about the changes that are taking place in terms of our natural systems, against that background, the World Bank has underwritten the Chad-Cameroon pipeline and the Caspian Sea pipeline. So my question to you at this point is, given what we know about the climate, why is not every project funded by the World Bank carbon neutral as a condition of being funded?
Yeah, there's a very straightforward answer to that, and that is the bank for a long while, especially in its early years, was accused of knowing all the answers to all problems, that it was an extremely arrogant organisation and we knew what was best for development. Over the last 10 or so years, the bank has gone from being basically a supply side organisation to a demand side. That is to say, we have a conversation with our clients, which are developing countries, to try and make sure we understand what their view of development is, not what our view from the north is. And therefore, fundamentally, we cannot put conditionality on our loans. We can at one level, and that is to say that effectively they do have to be environmentally and socially sustainable. So now the question comes, are fossil fuels environmentally sustainable? Obviously, as we've talked today, earlier in the earlier session, I and most of the world's scientists do believe that burning of fossil fuels does indeed lead to climate change and with adverse consequences, especially for developing countries and poor people. However, the problem is fossil fuel energy is much cheaper than most renewable energy sources today, and our clients fundamentally do not want to borrow money for renewable energy projects unless there is a grant component. And so the bank is trying to facilitate the penetration of renewable energy technologies and more end-use efficient technologies through two types of grant mechanisms. One is the Global Environmental Facility. There's a very modest amount of money. And the other is what Ross has just mentioned, the Prototype Carbon Fund. So there are a number of people that would argue we should be much more carbon neutral on our projects, but fundamentally if we did that and we stipulated that we would no longer be in fossil fuels, no one would borrow from the World Bank. And there's a real balance. If we get out of energy completely, we can no longer be a voice at the table to try and change energy policies in developing countries by trying to get rid of distortionary policies such as fossil fuel subsidies subsidies, etc. So it's a balancing act. With respect to the Chad-Cameroon pipeline, yes, the bank effectively was involved. It was a relatively minor investment, but we had to face the following situation. Chad has almost no natural resources at all. It's one of the poorest countries in the world. It's also viewed to be one of the most corrupt, according to Amnesty International. Why would we effectively get involved in a pipeline from Chad through Cameroon? And at the end of the day, it was a long debate by the bank's management and the bank's board of directors, headed, of course, by Jim Wolfenson in both parts, and that was the overriding mission of the bank is poverty alleviation. Every analysis the bank did was there was no other way to help Chad other than to effectively help them with the Chad-Cameroon pipeline. That is still a contentious issue. We looked very carefully at all of the environmental issues, and we viewed, other than the fact it would produce oil for the northern countries, it was actually a fairly sound project. The last point is on the prototype carbon fund. We've now raised about $1 billion for clean energy projects. Every dollar we basically get in actually typically leverages another $4 to $8. So our $1 billion will probably leverage about $8 billion of real energy projects. Is that enough? No, it's 1 to 2 orders of magnitude less than we really need. We need to have hundreds of billions of dollars probably per year go into clean energy, basically. Unfortunately, what this requires is governments or the private sector to invest in these clean technologies. But at the moment, we need to have an international framework that stimulates clean technologies to penetrate the marketplace, and we don't have that.
I want to do one quick follow-up on the same topic, if I can. The Bush administration's climate and energy policies have been essentially in lockstep with or dictated by companies like ExxonMobil and Peabody Coal. And in fact, it was in response to a memo from ExxonMobil that the President failed to support you as head of the IPCC. And now the administration has put Paul Wolfowitz in as director of the World Bank. Wolfowitz's priority seems to lie in liberalizing North-South trade flows, promoting them more without any requirement for a clean energy component. And so my question is, what, in a personal way, where does this leave you vis-a-vis the World Bank and the new administration thereof?
You're going to be incredibly surprised by the answer. I've probably met Wolfowitz about 4 times, and a very senior staff member that works with him, and I've been extremely pleased. Because of the Glen Eagles meeting that took part earlier this year, where the G8 actually discussed climate change, the World Bank was actually asked to take a lead on trying to put an integrating financing mechanism together for climate change. Paul has done everything in his power to facilitate not only the vice presidency I'm in, the environmental and socially sustainable vice presidency, but also the one on infrastructure, to put together probably the best team we could in the bank, and to already have meetings with some of the private sector, some of the other regional banks so far. And so far, Wolfowitz has probably had more meetings on climate change than any other issue so far. And all I can say is there has been not a single impediment in our way, and so far he's been incredibly supportive of the work we're doing.
Good.
Steve, what I might say, this is Steve Kerwood here, that the reason perhaps why Mr. Wolfowitz is so accommodating is that the policies he outlined are seen by many as very accommodating to the fossil fuel industry. For example, let's go back to the question, the point that you made that, well, if we insisted on every loan that was made by the bank be climate neutral, nobody would take the money. Really?
Yes, really. China doesn't, I mean, you don't need every...
So what? That if nobody takes that money, what would be the harm then? Because the argument would be that if the money is used for destructive things, and clearly you believe that the use of fossil fuels is destructive to the world environment, wouldn't that be better than, if nothing being done, be better than having, in fact, climate busting, climate injuring technologies and systems being installed?
Our argument is at the moment that by being involved we have two possibilities. One is we can change the policy framework in these various countries to become more climate friendly, and there is evidence that when we are involved in the policy debate we have managed to get many of these countries to become more climate friendly. Secondly, we actually believe that if we actually are involved even in a fossil fuel plant, at least if we push the state-of-the-art technology so the efficiency is 45% rather than 35%, that's better than continuing plants at 35%. It's a trade-off, basically. We are now looking at potentially working with both India and China to try and repower as many, if not all, of their power plants, which on average are most of them are less than 30% efficient. And our view is if we could at least bring them up to 35 to 40% efficient, these power plants are going to run for the next 20 to 50 years whether we like it or not. So should we be involved in the fossil fuel at all? I would argue it's a sort of balance. And on balance, the general judgment at the moment is it's better for us to try and at least improve those power plants by 10% or so than actually leave it to the private sector that are looking for some in the private sector looking for very, very short-term results and very inefficient power plants. So it's a trade-off.
Well, of course, but I think the question would be raised that if those funds were in fact available for truly clean energy development, that a lot more of that would be leveraged so that is a 10% improvement versus a complete improvement for a climate-neutral installation. In fact, don't you encourage people to go with business as usual? You talked about a 70% reduction being necessary. So if you're willing to lend money for a 10% improvement in the face of a need for a 70% reduction, aren't you in fact sending a message to business that, well, business as usual or almost as usual is going to be okay? And just the last thing I'd like to ask you about this is we heard in the earlier panel that the leverage points for making change, because of the long period of time it takes to make these changes, is now. That waiting even another 5 or 10 years for more sophisticated technology, for more aggressive reductions, costs much more because in this case, you folks in the bank business like the compounding effects of interest. Well, in this case, we're talking about the compounding effects of carbon on the world's biosystems, and doesn't it make sense, in fact, to make as much of a change as you can make now, or at least, as the doctors would say, do no harm?
The answer is fairly straightforward, I think. At the moment, China has plans for somewhere between 500 and 600 coal-fired power plants in the next decade. They're going to be, on average, less than 35% efficient. All of them are going to be commercial. The bank's not involved in any of them. What we're considering is actually using some of our grant financing to at least improve those power plants from 35 to 45% efficient. So China doesn't need us. In fact, it doesn't. The fact that effectively we put conditionality on our loans to be environmentally and socially sustainable, literally all of China and India's power generation is commercial. The question then is, should the bank be involved in trying to at least improve what the commercial entity would be, which is 35 or less, and we're going to help to try and push it to 40 using the prototype carbon fund. Basically, our money is a loan, so it's not that the money would free up for something else in reality. Any of our money has to be repaid. If it was pure grant money, then I think it would be a slightly different situation, but the bank is a bank, and literally all of this money is repaid, except for the so-called prototype carbon fund or the global environmental facility. There's another very interesting statistic. Today, only 2 to 4% of all energy is modern renewable energy, with the exception of hydropower, and that's just is between 10 and 15%. Because of the additional cost of renewable energy at the moment, even the most optimistic scenarios only having renewable energy doubling or tripling its share of the market in the next 30 to 35 years. In other words, let's say it's 3% now, it might go to 6 to 9. It's highly unlikely to go more than 10. Therefore, the question is, given that everybody believes that fossil fuels will continue to be used, should the role of the bank at least be to make sure they're used efficiently? And the other basic problem is when a country like China or India looks at the US, they still see the US burning more coal, burning more fossil fuels, and their view is if the bank were to try and force them only to use renewable energy, they would absolutely walk away. It's a balance, basically.
Bill McKibben here. I want to follow up on those China questions a little bit. I spent the summer there doing some reporting that's in the current issue of Harper's, and I was, on the one hand, impressed by the seriousness with which certain Chinese leaders, at least rhetorically, took environmental questions, including carbon questions. On the other hand, I was impressed by the degree to which the rate of growth, and especially the rate of growth in the electric generating sector, seemed completely out of control, theirs or anyone else's. Adding the equivalent of twice New England's electric grid last year alone, almost all of it on coal. Given that you've talked about the need to hold atmospheric carbon concentrations at 450 parts per million, is anything that's going on now in terms of China's growth trajectory consistent with that, or are we just do we need to figure out some entirely new way of looking at what's happening there?
I think the problem is it's not only the growth in China, but there's a continuing reliance even in the USA on coal and many other countries, Russia and India, that makes 450 an incredible stretch target. The only way I see of making the 450 or so target actually is this new technology of carbon capture and storage, where we literally can capture the carbon from power plants and subduct it in oil wells, depleted gas wells, etc. But it's again controversial. The question is, what's the cost, and is the carbon truly there for life? And in fact there was an interesting article I saw only today about a Canadian experiment where they'd used this technique. They found it to be cost effective. It significantly improved the economic rate of return of the oil recovery, and it actually did subduct, so to speak, a large amount of carbon. Without that technology, I am actually not very optimistic. The combination that we're going to need to get to 450 or even 550 will effectively be something like carbon capture and storage, a very aggressive move on renewable energy, very aggressive, coupled with a very aggressive move on the way we use our energy. Cars that don't average 20 or 25 miles per gallon, but are indeed up at 50 to 100 miles per gallon. Much more efficient use of energy in the home, the appliances that we use, making industry as efficient as possible. So I don't believe there's one silver bullet. But what the world's going to have to ask itself is also some tough questions. Is nuclear an acceptable form of energy or not? Is large hydro an acceptable form of energy or not? While large hydro is probably largely tapped out in OECD countries, in many developing countries there is still potential for large hydro. The problem with large hydro is it tends to displace people, and it comes at a loss of ecological systems. And so the question really is, if we don't like fossil fuels, I certainly would prefer that we are not emitting CO2 into the atmosphere. My only hope of continuing to use it is this carbon capture approach. But the question is the world willing to have a significant increase in nuclear? Is the world willing, at least in developing countries, to have a significant increase in hydro? They're tough choices, basically.
Laying aside for just a moment the technology, at the moment in the world, the Europeans are at least sort of doing what we hope people will be doing. The Kyoto process is sort of underway in Europe and in Japan. My sense in China, talking to lots of people, was that China and the U.S. have become each other's enablers in doing nothing, that politically they serve as convenient cover for each other. What do you see as breaking that cycle at some point?
I think your guess and the others on this panel is at least as good as mine. Fundamentally, China's argument, I would imagine, and I don't work specifically in China, but the same in India, is to get out of poverty, to be a world superpower, we need energy. And we're going to follow the same development pathway of Europe and North America, and that is to exploit our cheapest forms of energy, which are coal, especially in China with huge coal reserves. India not far behind as well. And therefore the question is, can we demonstrate to China that it's becoming its own worst enemy? That is to say, by relying on fossil fuels, it is one, hurting its local economy because of local and regional air pollution, and developing countries such as China are the most vulnerable to long-term climate change. We have not managed to sell that message adequately. We haven't sold that message in the United States that climate change is a serious issue. And therefore, for a country that realizes it must expand its energy production in order to get out of poverty, it's doubly hard, basically. And so my hope would be that we can actually get China to realize, and India, and Russia, that they need to get off of fossil fuels, or if they were to use them, we have to find a way not to emit carbon into the atmosphere. But it's an incredible challenge.
This is Ross Gelspan, and I wanted to follow up on something you've said and that Bill said also. Bill referenced the very ambitious plans that are going on in Europe, and you keep referencing the fact that the U.S. continues to essentially not change its carbon-based diet. I had some conversations with officials of the French, Swiss, and Canadian governments about 8 or 9 months before the Kyoto Protocol took effect. And at that point, they were talking about, after the protocol took effect, bringing the U.S. to court under the World Trade Organization. And their argument was that the WTO prohibits governments from subsidizing its own products. If these countries are all drawing down their emissions according to the Kyoto schedule, they were going to go to court under the WTO and charge the U.S. with carbon subsidizing its products and move for very stiff taxes on U.S. exports. Have you heard much about that, or do you think it has much of a chance of getting off the ground?
Again, I'm not an expert on the WTO, except it also takes a long while to do anything in WTO. I haven't heard much about it, to be quite honest, and whether it would have any chance of success, I'm even less of an expert to be able to comment on it, basically. But we have to realize, even though there's some grandiose comments in Europe about aggressively addressing the climate issue, most European governments are way, way ahead of the targets that they agreed to in Kyoto, and they are actually now looking for cheap reductions, not domestically, but internationally, through carbon trading. And so when you get countries such as the Netherlands, etc., all saying we want to meet certain targets, and I truly believe they mean it, at the moment they have not turned down their own carbon consumption. Effectively, Spain is way above its target, Netherlands is way above. The UK is probably roughly on track, and maybe even ahead of its track. But when you start looking across the European Union, why is Spain, Italy, the Netherlands, etc., all putting money into the World Bank? They have actually not changed their energy technologies and policies themselves. They're looking for low-hanging fruit in developing countries. And so while the rhetoric in some parts of Europe is outstanding, only some of those countries have actually started to turn it around.
So what's the way out here? I mean, what I'm hearing from you, Dr. Watson, is on the one hand we have this huge need, but the World Bank can't do it. I mean, we won't be able to lend money if we don't do, carbon-intensive stuff. The U.S., everyone's addicted to carbon-intensive types of energy, and I mean, it's a pretty dismal picture you have. It sounds like this. Why do you go to work every day?
Because I remain an optimist. I was asked exactly the same questions on stratospheric ozone depletion a decade ago, when effectively we were making no great progress on reducing the emission of chlorofluorocarbons into the atmosphere and bromine-containing compounds, and effectively we were not making very much progress, even though the scientific community was arguing that these chlorine and bromine compounds were destroying the Earth's ozone layer and effectively leading potentially to more cases of skin cancer at the Earth's surface. And my comment was sooner or later we would wake up, and we did. And it was indeed a combination of leadership in government with a leadership in the private sector, and it needs at least that combination. So why am I partially optimistic?
Wait a second, you were optimistic at the beginning, now you're partially optimistic.
I believe we will address the issue. The question is, to what degree will we see a change in climate? Some change is inevitable. The question is, are we going to have to live with another 1 degree change, a 2 degree change, a 3 degree change, or a 4 degree change? I would like to hope we could limit it to no more than 2 degrees Celsius relative to pre-industrial. But that's probably me being the optimist. But some of us have to be optimistic and keep pushing the envelope, basically. And the three of you at this panel have probably done more than anybody else to sort of make sure that the public realises what the stakes are, the governments realise what the stakes are. So the three of you have to take incredible credit for trying to get this message across both the government, the private sector and the public at large. And so between the three of you and between the scientific community, we're still not doing a great job. We're still not succeeding in getting the policies and the technologies changed. Why am I somewhat optimistic, partially optimistic? I do see some leaders like Brown, the head of British Petroleum, the ex-chairman of Shell, Sir Mark Moody-Stewart, the head of DuPont, all arguing that they can make a profit out of being climate friendly, at least turning the curve somewhat. We do still have world leaders in Europe that are willing to keep talking about the issue, such as Blair, Schroeder before he got eliminated in the last round by Merkel. He was talking about it, but much quieter than the previous years. I think we fundamentally have to be optimistic. The problem with the world is it often puts itself on the brink of a major problem before it draws back, basically. I'm optimistic that overall we will not allow ourselves to go over that brink and then start to put ourselves on a path of these very high climate projections. Why? Sooner or later, I actually believe there will be leaders like John McCain, there will be leaders like Schwarzenegger in California, couple it with some of the other leaders, basically, in the private sector, and the public screaming, finally, that this is an issue they care about. But we don't exactly have the US public screaming for action either, independent of what you guys have been doing in the media, independent of what some of the scientists have been doing through IPCC. And so overall, I would have to say that we have not yet resonated in the US. And for China and India to do something, their comment is, why the heck should we do anything if the richest country in the world that's emitting 25% of the world's fossil fuels is not itself willing to take some action? And if I was in China and India, it's a question that I think is a pretty reasonable question.
Bill McKibben, absolutely. And this raises, maybe this question that's at the bottom of all of this about how to get people more energized, working harder, more committed around this issue. It's never risen to the fore as a political issue in this country. It's never been in the top 5 or 10 reasons that people announce they're voting for a candidate. Our political candidates don't even feel the need to mention it, for the most part, running for office. One of the things that strikes me, having reported and written about this for 20 years or so, is that my sense is that there is a much stronger sense of urgency among scientists now than there was a decade or 2 decades ago. One way of saying that might be, in the late 1980s, there was a lot of talk about, where, we could see surprises on either side, we're just beginning to understand. My sense is, and it was amplified by listening to you all earlier this afternoon, that the surprises keep coming in on the high side, that things keep getting not just a little worse, but in fact, that the sensitivity of the planet to a 1 degree Fahrenheit increase in temperature turns out to be a lot more than we thought. Is there a way, if that's true, for scientists to go a little beyond where we've gone so far in communicating that sense of urgency? Is there a chance for another kind of Jim Hansen moment, when we sort of seize the imagination?
That's a valid point. I think there is more urgency in the scientific community. All of the scientific results of the last, say, 10 years, every time it's got to be more and more of an urgent issue. We've now seen, as Jim McCarthy said in the previous panel, that the 10 warmest years have all been in the last 15 or less years. The Arctic sea ice is melting now at a faster rate than ever before. There seems to be a greater incidence of floods and droughts. There appears potentially to be a greater incidence of more severe hurricanes. All of this, you would argue, seems to suggest that the problem is at least as severe, if not more severe, than we've been talking about for the last 10 years. But there are still sceptics on the other side, like Dick Linds and Pat Michaels, who have incredible visibility in the media. That quite often when the media basically when something's reported in the media, often it's two sides of the coin. A great cartoon that came out effectively after the Millennium Ecosystem was published, which I was the board co-chair, with 1,367 scientists. There's a cartoon in the Washington Post that basically says, talking to President Bush, 1,367 scientists have said that we're now destroying the Earth's ecosystems. And the response was, I've asked for a second opinion. And, I mean, you know, this unfortunately is exactly what's happening. So while the very, very large majority of the climate community believes this is a very serious issue, and all the evidence just makes it more so, somehow in the media, the limited number of skeptics have got equal airtime, I would say, and have certainly got equal or more airtime at the moment in Congress.
Does that raise, I mean, you've watched this IPCC process closer than anyone, and it's clearly been one of the great achievements in the history of science that one was able to achieve in short order, that kind of understanding of a problem and things. But does that, the situation you've just described, raise questions in your mind about whether there might be some way for scientists as to speak more strongly than they have so far to make people really understand the kind of gut-wrenching level of urgency that I think many scientists actually feel?
Unfortunately, most scientists tend to be somewhat conservative, and so when someone like Jim Hansen was willing to speak out more than a decade ago now, almost 20 years ago, it's actually a little bit unusual. The equivalent, of course, of people like Sherry Rowland speaking out on the ozone issue. I think anybody in the scientific community has the opportunity to speak out. The IPCC, by its very nature, can give you a very solid state of science, but it can't be the voice, just the way it's an intergovernmental process. So it will require individuals, but then it will require either the media or some in the media to be their outlet, and or some in Congress to allow, taking a US perspective of course here, someone in Congress to allow them to have a stage in Congress. And so the problem is at the moment there is not much of a stage in Congress because by definition when it's controlled by the Republicans they choose who testifies, etc. And so therefore there's probably limited. The point I would make was an interesting one, and it's a parallel to ozone. That was the issue that I spent probably as much time on as climate change until recently. And for a while, effectively, what we had on ozone was people saying the data's bad and the models are bad. Why should you have national or international action? But every new piece of information that we had from the mid-80s through to the year 2000, every piece made it worse and worse and worse and worse. And it's some of those same skeptics that were trying to trash the ozone story, people like Pat Michaels, Fred Singer, are the same skeptics that are trying to trash climate. And yet they still seem to have some magic credibility with some of the media or some in Congress, and I don't understand it. So why they have any credibility at all is partly beyond me. The second point I would make is, why did the ozone story get resonance in some respects more than climate? This is a personal view, of course, but the end result of ozone depletion was more ultraviolet radiation reaching the Earth's surface and basically giving cancer, skin cancer, to light-skinned people, i.e. Middle America and Europe. Whereas on climate change, the most vulnerable will be very poor people in developing countries in the tropics and subtropics. That is not to say the US is immune from climate change. It's not. But we are less vulnerable than the average person in the tropics and subtropics. And I think the fact that we are less vulnerable maybe also is one of the potential reasons why we don't have the American public screaming for action, whereas there was a point in time in the ozone debate where they were pretty vocal.
Well, I think I'm sorry. This is please the applause for Dr. Watson. Steve Curwood here again. Well, let's carry this line a little bit further, Dr. Watson, because I think that you put your finger on something that a lot of folks are asking about, and this is, of course, the equity issue here. But I think it goes deeper than skin color, if you will, or ultraviolet and skin color. Because unlike the question of UV and certain populations at higher latitudes being more at risk and such, as I understand the science, it's an illusion that the richer part of the world is less vulnerable to the ravages of climate change. As somebody asked me the other day, what if this year, along with Katrina, things had gone wrong for Houston, and it seemed to be fairly close. Things had gone wrong for Miami and South Florida. They went plenty wrong there, but really had gone wrong. What kind of situation would we be in? If, I think some of the Greenland ice data that Professor McCarthy and others are talking about, if you're talking about 7 meters of sea level rise around the planet, I don't know that just gets poor people in Mali. But here's the core question. I think it's also an illusion that the affluent part of the world bears little responsibility for this. The Chinese and the Indians, you say, look at the U.S. and say, well, why should they do anything if the United States doesn't do anything? Well, the very fact that there's a World Bank that's funded by the European, by the OECD nations, is a function of their intensive use of carbon over these generations, and tremendous wealth has been aggregated by that. And I guess my question to you is where is the voice for the large equity disparity here? Where is the voice of calling to account how the rich part of the world has gotten rich while this problem has developed? Talking about making profits and cleaning up from the climate, destroying the climate has been extremely profitable. So how do you begin to crack this in a society which would just as soon be in denial? And I'll close this long-winded question by saying, look around the folks in the climate debate, and you see a lot of folks from very affluent parts of the world concerned about it, but not really calling the basis of their affluence to account. So you're a scientist, but now I want you to be a social theoretician here and tell us how do we move ahead?
It's interesting. There was a 60 Minutes on last night with Bono from U2, which I thought was one of the more interesting interviews I've seen. And I think Bono has actually brought to the attention of the world the AIDS issue and the poverty issue, especially in Africa. And they showed him actually with President Bush and other former and current and former world leaders, and he basically said you have to talk to finance ministers and you have to be able to open the door to the most conservative of politicians. The bleeding heart liberals' message today goes nowhere, which is an interesting point he made. We don't have the equivalent of a Bono on the climate change issue or probably any other environmental issue. There are some visible people involved, but they're not resonating in the way that Bono, I truly believe, did help the debate on both poverty and on AIDS. So that's a personal view of Bono's role. The question is, are we, the rich countries, less vulnerable than poor countries? Now, to a 7-meter sea level rise, obviously large areas throughout the world would clearly be destroyed. But I would argue that we are slightly less vulnerable than developing countries in the following sense. First, our agricultural systems are far more robust and less vulnerable to climate change. Why? In a developing country, temperature is a key factor, and unfortunately all crops are beyond what we call a temperature optimum in the tropics and subtropics. So any warming, however small, half a degree, 1 degree, 2 degrees, let alone 3, 4, 5, 6 degrees, means productivity decreases. Whereas in the temperate regions, the US and the higher latitudes, we're below the temperature optimum. So any temperature increase for at least a while will increase productivity, subject to the rainfall being reasonable. But also, we project actually that rainfall will be reasonable and will not significantly decrease in the temperate and the northern hemisphere, whereas it will decrease in most of the arid and semi-arid areas. And so for agriculture, there is actually a fairly large difference between the temperate regions and the tropics and subtropics. Having said that, if we do end up in something like 3 to 6 degrees Celsius, even agriculture in North America will start to suffer. But we do have more capability to adapt than a poor person in Mali. We have institutional capability that you don't have in developing countries. We have technology that they don't have. We have knowledge and access to knowledge, and we have effectively financing. And so in many cases, poverty itself, and that's what most of the tropics and subtropics have, poverty itself exacerbates the vulnerability to climate change. And so I do believe that the richer world has more opportunity to adapt to a changing climate than a poorer world. Having said that, our ecosystems are definitely vulnerable. There is no question. We will almost certainly lose the Florida Everglades. The old-growth redwood forest, we will lose. Now, the problem is, assume that we're right, that there will be a 2 to 6 degrees Celsius rise in the US. In 100 years, those redwood forests will look the same as they are today, and in 200 years, they'll probably look fairly similar. Assume we haven't cut them down, of course. The problem is they will never re-establish. And the trouble is it takes time to see a change in a long-lived ecological system. So in any forested system, many of them are probably dead and dying today, but we will actually not be able to observe it until we see what I call the turnover, the re-establishment. A coral reef you can see in months. It has a very fast dynamics, basically. So ecosystems are going to be very vulnerable. In human health, we're less vulnerable because we have, and some people will debate this at least, a fairly good healthcare system if you can afford it in North America, versus if you're in Mali, there is no healthcare system, or at least, I mean, I'm talking in relative terms now, basically. And that's why I would say that we are less vulnerable, but we're not. But we are still vulnerable at one level. And so, so there is very much an equity issue, and that is to a large extent we, the North, have put most of the greenhouse gases into the Earth's atmosphere and hence have caused the problem today. But we have to recognise, at least on an absolute basis, developing country emissions will exceed ours in the developed world within 10 or 20 years. On a per capita basis, they'll still be way below ours. And so fundamentally there's a key issue. Now, again, rightly so, the role of the bank. The bank fundamentally lends about $20 billion a year. Sounds a lot of money. But we're in a world of a $33 to $40 trillion budget. The bank is a very, very minor player in development. We're less than probably... We've never been more than a few % of energy lending. We are largest in Africa. We're very, very small in China, India and Russia. Very, very small. And so effectively it would be very, very hard for the bank to play a role of completely changing the energy system. That's why I was actually rather pleased when effectively the G8 did ask the bank to start to look at a much more integrating financing system that brought the bank in line with the other regional banks and the private sector and the governments to see, can we do something to try and be more climate friendly or a low carbon economy. And as I said earlier, to date, Mr. Wolfowitz has effectively fully supported that approach. In a year's time, let's look back to see if we've accomplished anything. And so...
this is Ross Gelspan again. I want to follow up with what you're talking about a bit, and also your insistence on the need for the private sector to be involved. and also your concern about the skeptics who are essentially mouthpieces for ExxonMobil, Peabody Coal, and other fossil fuel companies. There are a number of large companies that have been very good on carbon, and I'm thinking here of BP and Shell and Alcoa and a number of companies that have really significantly reduced their carbon footprint. These companies are clearly doing it for profitable reasons. It's internally streamlining. They're getting all kinds of accolades from the environmentalists, and I'd love to find out a way for them to put their money where their mouth is and to mobilize them into a lobbying force in the U.S. Congress that will counteract the skeptics and big coal and big oil. And I wonder if you have any notions along that line that you're allowed to talk about in the public forum.
I don't know any more about these companies than you. Individually, they've been they've clearly decided that to be more climate friendly, one, they can make a profit out of it. Two, it's superb public relations. Three, by being at the forefront, they will not have to respond quickly to new regulations, so they're ahead of the game. Four, there might be new technologies and they can create new marketplace, so they've got the first mover advantage. But they also realise that by being proactive, many governments are willing to work with them on policy for it. So there's about 4 or 5 reasons to be proactive. But it is still, at the moment, the minority of companies. I would argue if they could actually work together as an alliance, especially now that General Electric is one of them as well, DuPont's another one, you've got some of the most powerful companies in the world, but they seem to be acting independently, not collectively. And the question is whether they could have a larger voice through the World Business Council on Sustainable Development, but it isn't a voice that's particularly being heard at the moment, and I don't know why, basically. Why they would not go and lobby in Congress is that something that only they know, that there may be some other issues that they don't want brought up at the same time. And so I have not seen, either on the ozone issue or the climate issue, a very, very strong lobby from those proactive governments. Even in the ozone issue, when DuPont led the charge of industry to actually help to eliminate chlorine and bromine chemicals, they still didn't go to Congress to actually argue very forcefully for it. I mean, they did say, yes, our policy is the following, but they didn't actually argue forcefully for a change in either US or international policies.
I wonder if, Steve Kerwood again, I wonder, Dr. Watson, you left one other rationale for these companies to be making this move. As I understand it, most of the companies that you have enumerated have engaged in a strategic planning process that's gotten them to this. In other words, I wonder if it's simply self-survival. They realize that if the planet goes out of business, they go out of business too.
Oh, I think most individuals and most companies and probably most governments work on self-interest. I mean, I think that's probably one of the most powerful motivating forces that's around. And I think British Petroleum probably saw several things, and that is, one, oil is a finite resource anyway. Two, I believe John Brown himself does care deeply about the future and the environment. And so I think when you get someone such as a leader as Lord Brown, you actually bring many reasons together, and at the end of the day, does it really matter what motivated him and these other business leaders, as long as they're motivated and moving in the same direction? So I'm sure you could pick that there's at least 50 companies working with Eileen Clausen and the Pew Foundation that are trying to be more proactive on climate, and my guess is every one of them has a different set of reasons for being proactive, to be quite honest. But at the end of the day, my view is it doesn't really matter, as long as they're, for one reason or another, they actually recognise that we do need to change the way we produce and use energy. And it isn't just energy, I should actually be broader. There are many greenhouse gases that come from the agricultural sector and other parts of industry. I've actually been a bit lax today of only focusing on energy. It's broader than energy. The agricultural sector is extremely important, and so is the waste management sector, so I should have actually been a bit broader.
I want to be a little bit broader still. Your portfolio now includes a whole list of questions of environmental sustainability. We've agreed to be optimistic here today because what other path really is there? But one of the things that strikes me as pessimistic about our current problem is that global warming isn't occurring in a vacuum. It seems to be beginning to strike at the same time that a number of other deep environmental problems are starting to pinch. For instance, probably most spectacularly, at the same moment that we're beginning to really worry about agricultural problems connected with heat stress in the tropics of various crops, we're also seeing dramatic falls in water tables due to overpumping and having to cease irrigation across parts of the North China Plain or the Punjab. How do those, on the one hand, how do those things in your mind sort of interact to make a problem? And on the other hand, is there some way in which they might interact to allow us some broader solutions, to look at a sort of deeper pattern of solutions even than the sort of carbon things we've been discussing?
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. About almost 10 years ago now, I put together a very small team of scientists, about 40 of us, to actually look at this whole issue of what we call interlinkages. And it was indeed to say that there was a series of environmental issues that are very strongly interlinked. And the issues that we identified at the time were indeed stratospheric ozone depletion, global warming, ecosystem degradation, persistent organic pollutants, loss of forests, which is linked to ecosystem degradation, desertification and water scarcity. And what we argued in that paper was effectively that the genesis of all of these issues is very similar. It's effectively we have demographic change, an increasing population. We also have an ever-increasing wealthier population. So the demand for goods and services, to some degree, is dependent on the number of people on the planet, their ability to afford to buy services, and the way we overconsume, and that we are not effectively taking a long-term view. We tend to take a short-term view. So we actually put a little document together that largely focused on what the scientific interlinkages were. Climate change affects ecosystems, it affects water, it affects desertification, it adversely affects forest. Equally, if you lose some biological diversity, you also, in a way, back affect the nutrient cycling and biogeochemical. It affects stratospheric ozone depletion. It affects climate change. It affects water. So all of these things are absolutely linked. The problem we've got is, both at the national and international level, we are stovepiped. We have one national agency that tends to look at water issues, another agency looks at forests, another agency looks at energy, another agency looks at agriculture. Equally, at the international level, we have a convention on biodiversity, a convention on desertification, a convention on climate, a convention on ozone, a convention on POPs, persistent organic pollutants, and they almost don't talk to each other. In fact, they don't talk to each other at any meaningful level. And so we have a very stovepiped way of looking at these issues. At the beginning it made sense. If you try and take the whole world on, it's so damn complex that you can't actually sort of see, you can't work out what's going on. But now we understand the relationship between humans and climate, humans and ecosystem degradation, humans and desertification, etc. And we now understand at some level the interactions between them. We now need to put together a policy framework nationally and globally to see both synergies and trade-offs. And I'll give an example. It's great when we can find a policy or a technology that is both good for meeting a development goal, it could be more food, and simultaneously is good for climate and good for biodiversity and, say, water. But there are many policies and technologies that may be good for one environmental issue that could be a disaster for another. For example, modern biofuels done well could actually be good for producing clean energy, therefore good for climate, and could, done well, be good for rural development. Done badly, it could be a disaster for biodiversity. So we do need to do exactly what you've done, and that is to stop looking at these issues one at a time and start to look at them in a more holistic manner to see both where there are win-win situations and where there are win-lose, and look at those trade-offs in a much more meaningful way. There's another document which I'm only superficially involved in as an author called the Global Environmental Outlook that the United Nations Environment puts out Now it's every 5 years. And one of the major chapters in that document is on interlinkages, and it will indeed be looking at not so much the scientific interlinkages, because I think we've looked at those carefully, but the policy interlinkages. And in a new international assessment that I'm directing on agriculture, and that is how can we use the agricultural sector to alleviate poverty, improve human nutrition, alleviate hunger, and how can we do that in a way that is both environmentally, socially sustainable. We will be taking a much more holistic look at these environmental issues and how there are win-win and win-lose situations. So your point is well taken. The trouble is there's a lot of resistance in taking a holistic view, because each person's got a piece of turf. The Climate Convention's got a turf, the Biodiversity Convention's got a turf, the desertification's got a turf. If you put all of these together, certain people lose political power. And so in some respects, there's actually some resistance to what is totally rational and logical to do.
To follow up on that, and to follow up with a question that's much too large to even be fair to ask, but just to get the things that pass through your mind. When you identified carbon capture as the one sort of technological wild card that might give us some promise, the one thing we didn't sort of think about 20 years ago that really might turn out to be some help maybe. Is there some single thing you could identify as a kind of cultural shift, especially in the rich world, that might allow us some of the same kind of large order possibilities? People talk about the shift to more local economies, or all kinds of things. Is there anything that you can, any sort of fantasy that you can project that might help us in the sort of numbers that we need to, the scale that we need to be helped on?
I don't have any clever ideas on it, but it will take more than just technologies and policies. It will take a behavioural change that we do value the environment. And I think there's a lot of people do value the environment, there's no question, but it's going to take a major cultural shift. But this is a game where I would see the media is going to have to play a very, very major role. What I find is the good television programs on environment are all on things like PBS. You rarely find them in Washington DC on NBC, ABC and CBS. So there are some superb. In England I actually see some of the same types of program on BBC and even occasionally on ITV. In other words, the main commercial channels. And so the question is, if one's going to reach the American public and look for a behavioural shift, the first thing is, how do we try and mainstream some of this into mainstream TV programming? I'm about to, and I've never done this before, I'm about to sort of be the compere or the host of a 2-hour television programme on climate change, where I literally will be the narrator. Where? Japan. Don't ask me why, but NHK TV want me to spend 2 hours narrating this programme, which I'm going to do. But I find it very interesting. There's no chance of someone in US television ever asking that question. So I think one of the questions is, if we're going to see a cultural shift, it's going to need all the way from primary school, secondary school, university, the print media, the radio, and the television. There's going to have to be now, some things have changed. Recycling. No one used to recycle. I don't know what it was 20 years ago. Maybe it was longer ago now. Almost everyone recycles. The children got it. They came home from school, they saw daddy or mummy throwing something away and said, isn't that meant to be recycled? So the children put pressure internally on adults. I don't see the same thing happening at the moment on some of these other, but that means to say we need to actually get readable little books for children. When I went to New Zealand a number of years ago, there were these cartoon books on climate change. They were superbly well done, and they pointed out what climate change was, especially in the New Zealand culture and the New Zealand framework, and lots of these primary and secondary children were talking about climate change. And so I don't know what it will take, but it's going to take all of us working together.
I want to have one final question, if I can. This is Ross Gelspin again, and I'd like to go back to what I felt was your dismissing a little bit the transition to renewable energy and your promoting the notion of mechanical carbon sequestration. I mean, from a rather cynical viewpoint, This carbon sequestration basically looks like a full employment act for Halliburton and Bechtel, if you want to look at it from that point of view. But from another point of view, I can't understand why one would promote expensive carbon sequestration when you think of how many windmills could be built for the same amount of money. And you earlier gave some very pessimistic and small prognoses for the percentage of our energy that we can get from renewables out 10, 15, 20 years from now. But it seems to me there is no divinely ordained timetable or price for renewable energy. It's specifically a function of market creation and focused investment and political will. So, not to beat up on the World Bank, it only has $20 billion, but if invested all that money in clean energy in poor countries, it could begin to jumpstart this. So could a lot of other institutions and governments. I don't mean this as a World Bank question. I really mean it in a much larger way. And I would sort of conclude with something that was said by a predecessor executive director of the World Bank, Morris Miller, who was there during the middle 80s. And he wrote extensively about the fact that every dollar invested in energy in poor countries creates far more wealth and far more jobs than the same dollar invested in any other sector of the economy. So why the development and climate needs can't be brought together around a real push for clean energy, I really would leave that in your lap if I can.
Yeah, I don't have the answer, and I wasn't so much dismissive about renewable energy. I actually always believed that and I still do, that renewable energies are one for another will indeed be essential in order to have a more sustainable world. But I'm also becoming maybe more pragmatic, and that is to say, at this moment, there is no huge incentive to invest in renewable energy without, in my opinion, a very hard-hitting international accord on climate change that is not just 2008 to 2012 or 2013 to 2017. I think we have to put a long-term stretch target that's out at 2050 with some intermediate time steps, and I think that will absolutely force the investment in cleaner technology and force a technological innovation, personally. And so while we've only got these short-term time steps, I actually don't see it being the legal framework that will generate and stimulate technology innovation. But the problem what I see is there is a lot of cheap coal in some very powerful countries: Russia, India, the USA, China, and Australia. And so one of the basic points I've made, that I would make, is if carbon capture and storage were to be environmentally friendly and reasonably cost effective, suddenly those countries that are largely fighting even a short-term target, let alone a long-term target, may suddenly come on board. As it's simply that practical realism that suddenly you take out the opposition of the fossil fuel industry and 5 of the biggest countries in the world that are playing a major role internationally, basically. I mean, I think it's really as simple as that. I don't see that other single home run.
Thank you. Dr. Watson, Steve Curwood, Bill McKibben, thank you all very, very much.
Thank you indeed. You have been joining us for the Cambridge Forum for a program entitled Assessing the Health of the Environment with Dr. Robert Watson, Chief Scientist at the World Bank and co-chair of the United Nations Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Report. They were joined by author and environmentalist Bill McKibben